Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Gott, lebet, noch, which translates to God lives, He's here. All in all, fairly straightforward chorale. Longer chorales tend to have more real estate, right? So we imagine that perhaps there are more things potentially to write home about because there's more opportunities for things that are interesting to occur, and that is the case in this chorale as well. There are a couple of interesting chord progressions in comparison to your average chorale. I do think that we should go into this chorale with a grain of salt, though, however, because of the fact that it is in 3/4 time, and a lot of these progressions are kind of blurring the line between subdivided and kind of a fluctuating harmonic rhythm. So some of these chord progressions, even though they look like they're on the beat, on numbered notes, harmonic rhythmic notes, traditionally speaking, chord progressions or chorales in general that are in 3/4 time tend to blur the line between what regular harmonic rhythm is, because you can see there are plenty of measures that have harmonizations on every beat, and there are some measures where that second beat is just a passing. So there's pretty regular switching between these two modes, and these chord progressions occur in this context. So with that being said, let's just hop right into the analysis. So 1 flat in the key signature, we start on F major, we end on F major. This chorale is pretty clearly in the key of F. Our first phrase is concluded with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of F major, and we start things off with actually one of the more interesting progressions. It looks like we have a phrase here that's pretty clearly in C major, F, A, B natural, and C from a melodic standpoint, but I don't think there's really enough context here to justify C major. Bach very quickly undoes that B natural that's in the melody in the bass here, which really just feels like kind of more of an elaborate tonicization than anything else. So after our tonic F major, we have F again, F, C, F, and A, before we go to D, D, F, and B natural, which in this case, like I said, we haven't modulated, so I think this is 7/6 of 5, because B is the leading tone to C, and C is our dominant. And then we have C major, C, E, G, and C. So that's our 5 chord. It resolves the way we would expect, the 7/6 of 5 that is. C is still a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. B flat's like a passing 7th here. So we have an interesting harmonic rhythm here. The bass is changing, but I don't think the overall harmony is changing. That is like what chord's being implied. I suppose you could say a 4/2 chord is happening here. It does resolve that way, but I think the bass moving by itself doesn't really constitute a chord change. Just in the overall texture, I feel like more than one voice has to move. But afterwards, our 5 chord resolves to 1, A, C, F, and C. That's 1 in first inversion. And then we get another interesting chord progression. We have G, D, G, and B, and that's a 2 chord, G minor. Now, the reason why this chord progression is interesting is because we would typically expect like a diminished chord in this situation, like E diminished. That's the lens that I look at, or the lens in which I look at a lot of Bach's progressions, where 2 is somewhere to be pulled out of the texture. There's usually a 7 chord lurking about, but here with Bach, we don't see that. We just see a plain G minor chord that resolves to a F major chord that we just saw the beat before, 1/6, A, C, F, and C. This is interesting because 2/1 progressions are exceptionally rare in the chorales. When you see them, I mean, if they happen as plainly as this, it's pretty rare in a duple meter chorale, which most of the chorales are. They're like in a 4/4 the majority of the time. But in this case, I feel like the overall harmonic rhythm of this chorale is on beat 1 and on beat 3. So this waltzy sort of flowy feel between the chords, right? We have 1 chord on the strong beat and 1 chord on the pickup to the next beat, basically. So this 2 chord feels kind of like a passing chord in the grand scheme of things, which makes it look deceptively like a, like a 1-2-1 progression, pretty rare. But like I said, I think this 2 chord, even though this measure kind of feels like the harmonic rhythm is on every beat, I think in the grand scheme of trying to lump this whole chorale into one described harmonic rhythm, this 2 chord is happening off of the harmonic rhythm, and it's really just like a passing chord. But I'm going to leave it the way that it is. I feel like there are multiple interpretations of how you could look at this 2 chord, but to me, it feels kind of like a passing chord. I'm just going to leave it there and just explain it with my words. After our 1 chord, we get B flat, B flat, B flat, F, and D. That is our 4 chord in root position. And then we get A, F, F, and C, which is our tonic triad again in first inversion. This one chord's also sort of feeling like a passing chord as well. It really feels like the chords that are being implied are on beat 1, and we might get a chord into the next measure on beat 3, because we get that same B flat that we started off with in this measure 4 chord, B flat, F, and D. And then we're closing in on our cadence. We have G, B flat, G, and E. That's E diminished over G, which is 7, 6. And after some passing tones here, or some like sort of like double subdivided passing tones, because typically speaking, you know, like I've said up until this point, it really feels like whatever happens on beat 2 is sort of like a glorified passing tone or something that's happening off of the harmonic rhythm. 7, 6 is going to take us to a 2 chord, G, D, B flat, and D. 7 going to 2 is an exceptionally rare progression as well in Bach's chorales. And notice how 2 is happening at the same point. So I feel like we have 4 going to 7 here, and then 2 going to 5, C, C, B flat, and E. An incomplete 5-7 chord, but a 5-7 chord nonetheless. That leads us to F major, F, C, A, and F is our tonic triad. So these feel like separate ideas, but these eighth notes, I feel like they're key. They're sort of functioning as a buffer. That's the word that I've used in the past to describe this. A buffer between these 2 chords. 4 going to 7 is, for all intents and purposes, the same thing as 2 going to 5. So these eighth notes, the C and the A, are briefly introducing the non-tonic tones of F major. So it feels like there is a passing implied 1 chord happening here on the and of 1, like 2 layers of subdivision deep, because I am considering the second beat kind of a subdivision in the grand scheme of the harmonic rhythm, which does impact the way that I sort of grade or value the not the quality per se, but the exceptionality of these chord progressions. Like 2 going to 1 here, not really the most exciting instance of 2 going to 1. I've definitely seen more, because 2 sort of feels like a passing beat. It feels like the weakest beat of the measure. But this is our 1 chord. I feel like the fermata should have gone here, but this is how it was in the score, so I'm going to leave it there. It's still a 1 chord when it leaps down. And our next phrase is also in the key of F major for the most part, up until we get to the cadence, which is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C. Notice how long this chorale is and how few phrases there are. We've seen chorales that are like a third of this length with as many phrases. Well, a third is a little exaggeration, but half this length with as many phrases. This next phrase is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 measures long, which is pretty wild. But we stay pretty much in F major for the entirety of the phrase, and then we flip to C towards the end. So we start off with D minor, D, D, F, and A, which is our 6th chord, passing 7th in the bass, B flat, D, F, and B flat is a 4 chord. Kind of an interesting progression, 6 going to 4. Actually, if we take this 1 chord into consideration too, it's a thirds-based progression, 1, 6, 4. Kind of unusual in terms of what chords we would expect to happen in succession, but we do see it from time to time. It's just more on the uncommon side. But after 4, we get A, C, F, and C. That's F major in first inversion, 1, 6. D is a non-chord tone here. Maybe there's an argument that this is a 6-7 chord over A, but I don't really think that's what's happening. I feel like F and D are sort of enclosing E here. And I don't know, maybe this F is sort of being treated like a suspension of sorts. But we then have G, C, E, and B flat, which is C7 over G. That's 5, 4, 3. And this is ultimately, I don't want to say a substitute, but it's an analog for 7, 6. 1, 6 going to 7, 6, or 5, 4, 3 is typically followed by a root position tonic triad, F, C, F, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. This pattern is very common in the chorales. Not with 5-4-3. It's typically with the 7-6 chord, but here we have 5-4-3, and we're going to see another variation on this pattern later, which is really exciting. One of the more exciting moments for me in this chorale. But after our 1 chord, we have C, C, E, and G. It's good old C major. That's our 5 chord. Passing 7th in the bass. C here is, passing tones that happen on beat 2 sort of make me feel like really what's going on beat 2, and some of the measures that have more activity in all of the voices going on sort of just makes me feel like really the harmonic rhythm in this chorale is on beat 1 and on beat 3. But like I've mentioned before, in the triple meter chorales, Bach fluctuates, and that's sort of what I've accepted, is the fact that there isn't a regular harmonic rhythm, but you can use, there's typically a general trend to describe everything. If that's not implied by the harmony, you can just kind of see it on the page, and the more you work at it, you realize that, yeah, the chords that are happening on beat 2 are serving more of like a, I guess, like a transportational quality, right? They feel kind of like passing chords. Passing 7th in the bass here, we get A, C, F sharp, and A. Kind of an interesting chord here. F sharp diminished over A is 7-6 of 2. We've seen 7-6 of 5. Now we're seeing 7-6 of 2. And coming after a 5 chord, that's kind of interesting as well. We would typically expect 2 to go to 5, but this is an example of what I've been calling a transitive progression that goes against the grain of the falling 5th and it instead ascends a 5th. But it resolves the way we would expect: G, D, G, and B flat, which is our 2 chord. And that takes us to A, C, F, and A, which again is another 2-to-1 progression. It's kind of interesting because I feel like this progression is much more common when you permutate it so that the 2 is before the 5. And this 1-6 chord feels more like a passing chord than anything else, because the chord that we have here makes a little bit more sense narratively in terms of the harmonic language we expect from Bach, and that is after the 2 chord we get 5, B flat, C, E, and G, which is 5-4-2, and we would expect that to resolve to 1-6, A, C, F, and F, which is F major over A, 1-6. So the 4-2 chord resolves. It's kind of interesting 2 being placed here. But maybe 1-6 is just being used as a passing chord, or maybe like a substitute for 3 before 5-4-2. But going ahead, we're going to be modulating soon. We have a passing 7th here in the alto, and then we have B flat, D, and F, which is our 4 chord, B flat major. We have a neighbor tone here in the tenor as well, before we get G, B flat, E, and G, which is 7-6, E diminished over G, and we would expect this 4-7 progression to go to 1, F, C, F, and A, which it does, so that's good. F is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, and then we get E, C, G, and G, which is our 5 chord in first inversion, and I feel like this opens up the door to what could be the point in which we modulate, and I'm just going to say that that is the point we modulate. Because we're modulating to the key of C major, C and F have a lot of chords in common, so the fact that there are multiple chords that you could interpret a modulation on or during is largely negligible. It doesn't really matter where you mark it. What matters is that we definitely have a modulation to C major in time for the cadence. It feels like a glorified half cadence that is done by taking an extra step beyond tonicizing C major and instead kind of just going through the C major scale, just like we do here at the beginning of the chorale. Except at the beginning of the chorale, we're sort of one step behind what's happening here because this isn't a modulation, but we do see the C major scale fragment going on here. And this is a little bit more than just a fragment of the C major scale. We have the harmony to support it as well. So after our 1-6 chord, we have F, C, F, and A. That is our 4 chord in the key of C, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get D, D, F, and B natural. That is B diminished over D, which is, another 4-7-6 progression. We just saw this recently in the key of F. Now we're seeing it in the key of C. and then we go to C major, C, E, G, and C, which is our tonic triad in root position. So our next phrase ends in the key of D minor with a perfect authentic cadence, but starts in the key of F major. So we have a mid-phrase modulation. That's what I've been calling it, where the phrase starts in a new key from the previous phrase, or the previous key that we were in, and ends in an entirely different key than that. So we start in F. This C major chord here, C, G, C, and E, is both our tonic and our 5 chord in the key of F, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get A, F, C, and F, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. We then have B flat major, B flat, F, B flat, and D. Maybe there's an argument here that this is a 7 chord as well, but here it is 4 with a passing tone here in the tenor. And with this D sharp being activated or incorporated here in the tenor, I feel like this is in and around where we're modulating to the key of D minor. B flat, D, F, and D is still a 4 chord, and this C sharp is just a leading tone in the key of D major, sort of bringing attention to the third of that chord. And in the key of D minor, this is now our 6 chord. We then have A, D, B flat, and F. That is 6-4-2, or 7-4-2, I guess, because we want to trying to be a little bit more complete with my what's it called? Figured bass. That's the term I was looking for. So 7-4-2, we would expect this to go to a 2-6 chord, some type of first inversion 2 chord, and that's where it goes. G, G, B flat, and E. It's no longer our 7 chord in the key of F, it is our 2 chord in the key of D. So it resolves the way we would expect. A little neighbor tone here in the bass as well. And then we have G, F, B flat, and D, which is 4-7, G minor 7 in root position. Kind of an interesting progression here. This F neighbor tone does function a little bit kind of like a not a palate cleanser. I don't think we need to have our palates or like our ear palate cleansed at this point from a functional standpoint, but 2 and 4 are so similar to each other in pitch content and in function that this F brings you away from that, because F is not a chord tone to the key of not to the key of E, to this E diminished chord. It does end up making its way into the G minor 7 chord though, but this F is the third in the D minor chord as well. So I feel like it takes us away from this 2 chord briefly before reintroducing another similar chord. But regardless, it is a little unusual of a progression. After our 4-7 chord, we get A, E, A, and C sharp, which is 5, A major. A is a chord tone. And then we have G, C sharp, E, and A, which is A7 over G. That's 7-4-2, or just a 4-2 chord. And we would expect that to resolve to 1-6. We saw 6-4-2 go to 2-6, and here we're seeing 5-4-2 go to 1-6. F, D, A, and D. D minor over F. Passing tone in the bass. We also have this little late passing tone here in the alto, which gives us sort of a bit of a passing chord. I'm going to actually just call this a straight up passing chord, like E diminished, or E minor 7 flat 5. No, actually I'm going to take that back because we don't have a B in this chord, and I feel like B or B flat. B flat's probably the most important tone in terms of contextualizing this chord. We have 2 7ths, and even though the chord's being implied, it's not really here in an intact fashion. So after our 1-6 chord, we have D, C natural, F, and A. A really fascinating chord here because I hear this as a tonic 7 chord, and it really does sound that way. If you go to the chorale, the recording in the beginning of the video, you'll hear this chord this way, and it's really fascinating, very jazzy. And I really don't know how else to justify it other than that, because if you take a look at any note on either side, it doesn't really give context to the chord. This F happens sort of in passing, so maybe it feels more like a contrapuntal gesture, like this F is really moving towards this D happening here on the next beat, and this C is moving down to this B flat. But for this moment, it feels like a tonic 7 chord, which is very, very rare. We don't see tonic 7 chords in Bach all that often. But moving ahead, we have G, B flat, D, and B flat, which is our 4 chord, G minor. And then we have A, F, D, and A, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. Then we have like a subdivided chord progression here, as we would maybe expect in a duple meter chorale. This E and this C sharp here give us a 5 chord, A major, and sorry, this should be a 1-6-4 chord to a 5 happening here. They're typically paired with one another, but that's typically in cadential situations. In the middle of the phrase like this, I guess proximity-wise, we are kind of close to the cadence, but I mean the 1-6-4 and the 5 chords are typically what make up the cadence other than our final cadential chord. So 1-6-4 going to 5. I'm not going to really put a bracket there because they feel it's not really functioning in the same way that it does near the end of the chorale. We then have B flat, D, D, and G, which is G minor over B flat. That's 4-6, or maybe this is a 2-4-3 chord. I don't know. I think there's room for both. I'm just going to call it a 4-6 chord. No, it actually doesn't hurt just to write 2-4-3 down here. If this E, you hear it as a chord tone as opposed to this D, but I don't really think it makes too much of a difference because they both function the same way. We get A, F, D, and F, which is our tonic triad in root position here. Wow, this is interesting actually, that the tenor is singing the same note as the alto, or sorry, the melody, and the alto is singing below the tenor. It's pretty cool. But this is a 1-6-4 chord. Perhaps this 1-6-4 chord is a precursor to what's going to happen in the cadence. It's pretty interesting. And maybe even more interestingly, and to, I guess, further reinforce the point of the harmonic rhythm that I've been talking about at length in this chorale, we have non-chord tones here. Well, actually, this D is a chord tone, but this G is a neighbor tone here, and gives us a bit of a passing G, D, D, and F, which is maybe hinting at a 4-7 chord, interrupting our 1-6-4 going to 5, A, C sharp, and E. So in the case where we have an interrupted 1-6-4 going to 5, I've been using this hashed bracket here, where it's still implied, but there's some ornamentation in between the two chords. This F is a non-chord tone in this context, but will take us back down to D minor, D, F, A, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. Looking ahead to our next phrase, we have a bit of an ambiguous cadence, and we actually explore a couple of keys in this phrase. We end in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major, or maybe it's an imperfect authentic cadence. There's some ambiguity here because of where the cadence really feels like it happens versus the chord that the phrase actually ends on. And we've seen this a couple of times in the chorales. I'll talk about it when we get there. But we start off this phrase in the key of G minor, and I think it's a direct modulation because D minor is technically diatonic to G minor, but with the F sharp immediately after the D minor chord, it does feel like a separate idea entirely. I think the bigger picture of the chord that we start on here is actually a 5 chord, because when we take beat 1 and beat 2 and take the aggregate of all of the tones that are happening, we have D major, right? D, F sharp, A, and C. Maybe it's even a 5-7 chord, but you could also make the argument that this is a 7-6 chord, right? A, C, and F sharp. 5-7 versus 7-6. Can't spell a 5-7 chord without 7-6. They function the same way. It doesn't make a tremendous difference. But we're seeing this pattern again where beat 3 is dedicated to turning the 7 chord into a 4-2 chord, right? C, A, D, and F sharp. And I'll just write 4-2 there because I'm erring on the side of this actually being a 7 chord now that I'm thinking about it more closely. And when this 4-2 chord resolves, we would expect it to go to a G minor chord in first inversion. B flat, D, and G, 1-6. And here's another example of that pattern I've talked about, the 1-6 to 7-6 to 1 progression. A, C, C, and F sharp. That's F sharp diminished over A. And then we would expect this pattern to resolve to G minor, G, D, B flat, and G. So that's our tonic triad in root position. And here's another interesting progression as well, actually. We have kind of an unusual occurrence of chords here. We start off with D major, F sharp, A, D, and A. That's 5, 6. And then we get E, G, D, and B flat. This is kind of an interesting chord. This is E minor 7 flat 5, and this is diatonic to the key of G minor when we're using the melodic minor scale. This is 6, 7. And then we go to D major, D, F sharp, D, and, sorry, not D major, D7, C. So 5, 6, 6, 7, 5, 7. Kind of an interesting progression that I am likening to this progression right here at the beginning, where we have the 2 chord that's separating the two 1/6 chords. Of course, the bass doesn't move the exact same, but the progression all in all has the same overall feel, where a chord that we would expect to be a diatonic step below the 5 chord is actually a diatonic step above the 5 chord, which is interesting. We just have this descending melodic minor passage here. Typically we see melodic minor ascending. Here we see melodic minor descending. So the rule that melodic minor is natural on the way down might describe the majority of situations, but not all of them, depending on the contexts. But after our 5-7 chord, we're going to be modulating to F major soon anyways, but we would expect some type of resolution to G, which we get G, G, D, and B flat, which is our tonic triad in root position. And then we get another D7 chord, D, F sharp, C, and A, that we would in turn expect to resolve to G minor, kind of similar to the way that our previous phrase ended. We have a 1 going to a 5 chord, and then this pattern in the melody is retained, where we have a step up and then a skip down. So this B flat's a non-chord tone, but it is a chord tone to the chord that's going to happen afterwards, which is G minor, G, G, B flat, and G. 3 roots and 1/3 spelling, which coincidentally is our 2 chord in the key of F major as well. So 2 takes us to E, G, G, and C, which is C major over E. That's 5, 6. And the C is a chord tone here. This E is a chord tone. It briefly takes our chord and puts it in root position. I'll mark that. And then we get F major, F, A, F, and C. Tonic triad, root position. We then have E, C, G, and C again, which is another 5, 6 chord, C major over E. And then we get D, B flat, F, and D, which is our 4 chord in first inversion, 5, 6 to 4, 6. Kind of an interesting progression. We typically see it the other way around. 5 going to 4 is an unusual progression for sure. The same way that 5 going to 2 is an unusual progression. We would expect it to go the other way, but just because we expect it to go the other way doesn't mean that it can't go the way that we're seeing it here. So after 4, 6, this is the interesting progression I was talking about earlier. If you can remember, I was talking about a variation on, where is it? I don't want to get too hung up on this, but we had it earlier. I mean, I could just say this one right here, but I feel like we mentioned it somewhere earlier in the chorale. But this variation, 5, 6 going to 4, 6, is a take on this same 1, 6, 7, 6, 1 pattern, where we have 2 of the same chord that are an inversion apart, bridged by a passing chord that is a diatonic step below and in first inversion. So with that rule in mind, sorry, I don't mean to use the word rule there, but with that logic in mind, 5, 6 to 4, 6 should resolve to 5, which it does. C, C, E, and E. 2 roots and 2/3, but still a 5 chord in root position. So this is one of the first times, actually maybe even the first time we've seen this pattern. No, I feel like we've seen this pattern in the past. But after our 5 chord, we are going to be modulating to the key of C major soon, as we are closing in on our cadence. We have D minor 7, D, C, D, and F. An incomplete 6-7 chord that is going to be our 2-7 chord in the key of C minor. And then we get G, C, E, and E, which is our 5 chord in second inversion. That's kind of interesting. 5, 6, 4. Oh, you know what? Apologies. What am I talking about? I'm thinking that we're still in the key of F. This is a 1, 6, 4 chord. That makes a lot more sense. We have a passing tone in the alto as well before we get G, B, G, and D. And here's where we're going to employ the bracket for the first time. And this chord right here, C, C, G, and E, is where we feel like the cadence is actually landing, right? Because this is the resolution to our 1, 6, 4, 5 progression, and then we cadence. But then Bach continues the phrase until the third beat of the bar, where he reiterates the chord with the melody containing the root rather than the third of the chord. So to me, this sounds more like an imperfect authentic cadence, because this is where the cadence is happening in my mind. But perfect authentic cadence in the sense that the one chord actually finishes with its root in the melody. Ultimately, it's a fairly negligible detail, but it's kind of interesting in terms of, how would one go about deciding between the two different cadences. It is something to think about. But regardless, we're going to be staying in the key of F major for the rest of the chorale. This C major chord here is going to be our 5 chord as well, in the key of F major, and then we're in F for the rest of the chorale. Literally no chromaticism. A, C, F, and F. It's our tonic triad in first inversion. C is a chord tone, we don't need to mark it. And then we have F, C, F, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. So we'll just change the figured bass. B flat, F, and D. That's our 4 chord, B flat major. B flat's a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get A, C, F, and C, which is our tonic triad again, F major in first inversion. We then have G, D, G, and B flat, which is our 2 chord in root position, G minor, and that takes us to C, C, G, E, C, G, and C, which is our 5 chord in first inversion. 2 going to 5, 6. We've seen this progression in the past, right in the beginning here, F major, and that takes us to 1, F, C, F, and A, tonic triad root position. Alright, continuing, we have another measure where it's really just one big chord here. We have C, C, F, and G. This F is really just a 4-3 suspension over the bass, but what's being implied is C major, which is our 5 chord. The resolution happens on the second beat, and this B flat is a passing 7th. We would expect this to sort of resolve to a 1-6 chord, which it does. A, C, F, and C. F major over A, and then we go to F major in root position here when the bass changes to F, and we get an A as well here in the melody, so it sort of replaces or replenishes the thirds, or the third in the chord, so we have an intact chord on the passing part of the harmonic rhythm. And then we have F major in first inversion again, A, C, F, and F this time, 1-6. Alright. Next, B flat, F, and D, which is our 4 chord, B flat major. And then we get G, B flat, G, and E, which is E diminished over G, that's 7-6. If we're going to 7-6, we would expect that to resolve to 1, F, C, A, and F. It's our tonic triad in root position. And then we stay with the 1 chord here, F, C, F, and A, where this A gets introduced here and briefly takes our chord and puts it in first inversion. And we're closing in on our perfect authentic cadence here. We have G, D, F, and, B flat, D, F, and A, which is 4-7. B flat major 7 in root position. Passing tone in the tenor here before we get C, B flat, E, and G, which is 5-7. Just C7 in root position. C is a chord tone. F is a little anticipation here before we cadence on F major. F, A, C, and F, which is our tonic triad in root position. And that is today's chorale. All in all, a couple of things to take away from this chorale. First, the 2-1 progression. Whether you see this as a pretty clear 2 going to 1, and in this particular instance the harmonic rhythm is on every beat, it is something to be kind of wary of. I think that, I'm definitely going to take note of that in my own personal notes, and make sure to reference that later if I ever make a video on the topic of unusual chord progressions in the Bach chorales. We also have this idea of the 7 going to 2 progression as well, but this one's, taken with a little bit more salt, because we have this sort of passing implied F major chord here, or A minor chord in passing as well, which separates the two ideas of 4 going to 7 and 2 going to 5, because from a functional standpoint this is very redundant. They do the same thing, and either one of them could just resolve to 1 right here. So it's interesting that they both pop up, especially in such close proximity to one another. Then we have the tonic 7th chord, which is very interesting, right? We have this D minor 7 chord here in the key of D minor. Very unusual. We have seen maybe a couple of candidates for tonic 7 chord potentiality, but all in all, it is rare and not something that we expect to see in Bach's harmonic writing in the chorales especially. I know there's some instrumental work where you might see a tonic 7 chord. I'm thinking of like the prelude from the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier, right? There's that C major 7 chord that you resolve to at some point, I believe, if I'm remembering the progression properly, but I might not. That just goes to show how rare these tonic 7 chords are. We also have an uninterrupted. We have an interrupted 1, 6, 4 to 5 progression here with this neighbor tone in the bass here that kind of alludes to a 4/7 chord, but not really, kind of sorta. We're missing the 3rd in the chord, so we don't know exactly what the quality is, but we could assume that it would be a 4 chord or a 4 minor chord of some type, but we don't know, because it could be melodic minor and it could be a dominant 7 chord too. But interrupted 4/7 or 1, 6, 4, 5 progressions are always interesting, and I do take note of them. And then we have the 5, 6, 4, 6, 5 progression, which is interesting as well, because this is just another take on this pattern that we've seen at length in Bach, which is this 1, 7, 6, 1 progression. We've seen lots of different permutations of chords. I think the only one we haven't seen so far is like 7 going to 6, 6 going to 7, 6 or something like that, but that would be very, very interesting if we did see it. But yes, besides that, we have mid-phrase modulations abound in this chorale. F going to D minor here is a mid-phrase modulation. G minor going to F major, going to C major contains mid-phrase modulations as well. So I usually, or not usually, I would liken, or I'm not even trying to say that as well. Goodness, my brain is going a million miles an hour right now. I would attribute the mid-phrase modulations in this particular chorale to the length of the phrases. They're very, very long phrases, even for the chorale being in triple meter, which means that, there's one less beat in each measure that we're used to. Still very long phrases for as long of a melody as this is. That's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about in today's chorale. All in all, fairly straightforward. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification icon, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.